Hello, Thrifty Food Plan Channel friends. It's Jay. It is my last morning in the tiny house before I pack up and drive back to the big city. And I promised y'all that I'd do a reflection video at the end of my time here, and that's what we're doing today. I did write down some notes just so I don't forget things, and as I share some of my reflections about this experience, if there are things that come up for you that you're curious about that I don't talk about, just drop it in the comments below and I will answer questions down there. So first, I am here because there was a freelance work project that I had to do in person, and so put a bunch of things in place, and I've now been living in this tiny house for a couple of weeks, and what I would say is that it's not the first time that I've ever stayed in a tiny house or a cabin. I go to Moab, Utah every summer and I stay in a KOA cabin, but that's for a week. And I would say living in a tiny house full time for an extended period of time is very different than doing it for a week in the summer for fun, right? It's just a totally different kind of experience. Part of that's because it's extended time. So I would say that the things that I loved about this experience, I loved the simplicity of it. There is just, there is far less stuff in a tiny house because there's no place to put a bunch of stuff. And, I think I was worried that at some point it would start to feel kind of austere to me, and it didn't feel that way at all. It was it's been very centering, sort of the simplicity of it. And, that simplicity is reflected in everything from how I cooked to how I slept to how I dressed to how I spent my days. It was pretty simple, and it was kind of easy to get into a routine. And there was work that happened during the day while I was here when I could get out. Y'all know there have been a couple of storms since I've been up in the mountain. This tiny house is in the mountains, and I was snowed in for a bit. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I did love sort of the simplicity of all of it, and it just felt quieter to me. It enabled me to feel more centered and more purposeful kind of about my time. I read a lot of books. I had gotten a lot of books for Christmas from my family, and I read a lot of books up here. I did some movie nights, and I did a lot of walking. This tiny house is in a beautiful location, and so walking was definitely a hobby that I had while I was here living in the tiny. So I loved that piece of it, and I will really miss it. I'm going to try to figure out if there's a way for me to bring some of those sentiments and ways of being into my house in the big, what it now feels like a very big city. When I get back home later today, I don't know if it'll translate, because I do think that living in under 300 square feet kind of does require you to condense your life some and get back to the basics and the essentials, the essential ways of being. So let's talk about cooking and eating. That's kind of a focus of the channel here. I believe the times that I was able to have groceries and all of that, I feel like I was able to eat really, really well, and in many ways, in a way that's pretty parallel to how I eat at home while I was living here in the tiny. And, I did have fewer instruments with which to cook, so, I had a propane stovetop. I brought an air fryer with me. I brought a slow cooker with me. I had a pot. I had a saute pan. I had a tea kettle. I had a French press for coffee. And honestly, y'all, that was really all I needed. I didn't need the 10 other pans I have at my house. I didn't need that. I would say I did miss, some days I did miss a microwave, just to be able to reheat things. It just took more time to kind of reheat everything on the stove or in the air fryer. But I mean, I was able to eat diverse food. I roasted things in the air fryer, toasted bread in the air fryer, cooked a lot of things on the stove top, had big salads every day, oats every day. So the cooking and eating stuff felt good to me, even if I learned that I could cook a diverse diet, a nutrient dense, diverse diet with a smaller set of pots and pans and appliances and all those sorts of things. The only other thing I would say about food and cooking is that there's not a disposal in the tiny house, and I missed that. I missed a disposal. Like, I didn't like kind of getting all the goop out of the sink and putting it, I didn't like touching all that stuff. But that's me being a prima donna. It's not the end of the world, right? Not the end of the world. Yep. And then those of you who watch my channel know that when I'm at home, I am like a loyalist to my Kroger equivalent. And I shopped at a Walmart, and I shopped once at a Dollar Tree when I was up here. And what I would say is that the Walmart was actually cheaper. This last grocery shop that I did, I priced things out that I bought at the Walmart. I priced them out on the King Super app on the website. And King Super is like Kroger equivalent. And it turned out that, in fact, like, buying those items at the Walmart was $2.19 cheaper. Now, so on just buying things at the grocery store, the Walmart was cheaper for that grocery shop compared to my Kroger equivalent. But a couple of things about the Walmart, like the people weren't as nice as the Kroger people, the Kroger employees often are to me. And the other thing I would say is that because there's so much other stuff at a Walmart, I did feel sort of the draw of impulse buying for things that weren't food or groceries, right? I mean, I walked around the whole store. I didn't put anything in my cart, but I did walk around the whole store. So as I go home, the Kroger is the closest grocery store to me. There is a Walmart within 10 miles of my house. And I think if my Kroger equivalent does not have really good loss leaders or doesn't have really good coupons for me in a given week, I mean, I probably would save money if I shopped at the Walmart on the regular. And so that is something that I'll need to think about when I get back home. Now, some things that I had to learn and adjust to being up here. If you've watched the channel over the last couple of weeks, you know that we had back-to-back storms. So there was like a 10-day period really when it was really hard for me to get in and out of here. And I didn't grocery shop once and ate for a little over 2 weeks based off of that grocery shop and what I brought from home. Some of that is because of my car. So, like, if I were going to live up here in a tiny house in the mountains, I probably would need a different kind of car. I have a car that it has snow tires on it, but it sits pretty low to the ground. So when there's a lot of snow on the roads, like, I can't drive because I don't have enough clearance under my car. And so, like, if I were to do this full-time, real-time as my way of life, I would need a different kind of car, I think. The other things were, kind of when the storms were going through, the power would go on and off. So this tiny house does have regular electric, and the power would go on and off. Now, my stove was propane, so I was able to cook for myself even when the power was out. But the power going out meant things like the internet didn't work. So, I had some trouble doing videos and that sort of thing for y'all. The tiny house, though, also didn't have heat. It doesn't have like regular heat or gas heat. It has like space heaters. And so when the power would go out, it could get cold here. And as y'all saw in one of the videos, it was actually like -7 one night that I was here. And, that took a little trying to figure out. And even when the power was working consistently, I had some trouble figuring out how to regulate the temperature in the tiny house, because it has space. I had space heaters here to kind of, but it would get too hot or too cold. And then the other thing that happened, not related to the tiny, is that I don't know what was going on with my body, but my body decided that this period of time would be a great time to give me night sweats, right? So for all the ladies out there, and for the men who don't know, like when you're perimenopausal or menopausal, a common thing that happens is that you get like night sweats. And so on the nights that it was really cold, like I'd wake up sweaty, which then would make me freezing cold because I was wet, right? So anyway, that's less about the tiny house and just more about like whatever. My body just thought it would be a good idea to do that simultaneously. It was not a good idea. That's all I can say. I also had a couple of nights or a couple of days where the tap water line was frozen. When the power was on, I still had hot water, but I didn't have any tap water or cold water. And that interfered with both the refrigerator and the toilet, right? Because the toilet uses the tap line, not the hot water line. And so like that was a bit of an inconvenience that I had to work through. I mean, I just put hot water in the toilet tank and it would flush, right? And I just kept the refrigerator and freezer shut on the days when they were having a little trouble working. But the storms sort of were a real life factor that I hadn't really thought about and I wasn't prepared for. And then I would just say the last thing is two things actually. First, the tiny doesn't have laundry, so I would have to drive to the town like 20 miles away and do laundry, which isn't a big deal if you're not having storms, right? But at one point, like I was washing stuff in the hot water that I did have in the sink and trying to hang them up and get them to dry, but it took a while because it was freezing, And then I think the other big lesson I learned was really about having pantry items. And, if I did bring some pantry items up here with me, and I would just say, if I had not brought those pantry items up here with me, I would have run out of food during that period that I could not get to the grocery store safely. And so, I had a really big pantry during COVID, but I haven't sort of maintained a pantry, but like this, like a stockpile pantry. But this experience really is making me think that I do probably need to have at least 2 weeks of food on hand at any given point. And like I didn't have any canned vegetables, for example, and like when the freezer and the fridge were on the fritz because the water line was frozen, I didn't eat vegetables. I'd eaten through all my fresh produce and that, so there were just some things that I learned, and I probably do want to be more mindful about making sure that I have at least 2 weeks of food in pantry, including fruits and vegetables, not just beans. I had plenty of beans, not just beans and rice and pasta. Anyway, I did fine because I did bring some things up here with me. But if I had not, I would have run out of food, and it would have been a really big problem. And the food that I did have was not diverse enough to get all of my needed nutrients in during that period. So, lesson learned. So I think my final thoughts, part of the reason I was interested in doing this is because, if you watched my video about kind of why I shop and eat the way I do, I've had a pretty significant reduction in my income, and it is not at all clear to me that I'm going to be able to keep the house that I have, because if you follow the Dave Ramsey plan or any of those budget tools, your housing expenses should not exceed probably 25% of your pay. And at this point, you know, maintaining the house that I have and paying the mortgage and all the utilities and the insurance and repairs and all that. I'm pushing 50% easy. And so, I think I've always wondered, could I live in a tiny house instead of, my house is 1,400 square feet, so it's not like a McMansion. But a tiny house is clearly very small comparatively. And you know what? I think that I actually could live in a properly designed tiny house. Like this one has electric, it has real plumbing, it has all of those things. Those are requirements for me. I am not going to live in anywhere where I have to use, sawdust for my toilet. It's not going to happen. So, but I think after being here for weeks on end, I definitely could live in a tiny house all the time. Now, there are things that I would have to do for that to happen. We already talked about the car. I would need to learn how to maintain a tiny house. The people that I was renting it from kind of came over and helped me, like, get the water line unfrozen sort of once the temperatures went back up. Like, they came over and helped me with that because I didn't know how to do that myself, right? So there are definitely things that I would have to learn in order to live in a tiny house without, like, somebody to call and help me. I understand from watching YouTube videos and Tiny House Nation and all those kinds of things that, you can't actually put a tiny house anywhere. And so, I'd have to think through what the total cost of all of it. I'd have to buy land. I'd have to buy it somewhere, where it's close enough to civilization that I could get electric and plumbing. But, a lot of places you can't have a tiny house because a lot of municipalities and counties have, prohibitions on them or on mobile homes or that, so I just have to figure out all those technicalities. And then, I have to figure out how to make a living. Like, I had a discrete project here that I was working on these last weeks. That's different than being able to figure out how to make a living here 12 months out of a year. This is not a project that would last or convert to a full-time job. But all in all, y'all, I really, really enjoyed it. Even with like the storms and that inconvenience. There was just something very centering about the experience for me. And I am incredibly, incredibly grateful that I figured out how to make it happen and that I had the experience. It really does make my heart feel full. And I am going to spend some time kind of thinking about how I might bring some of the lessons about how I lived here to my house in the big city. But I've loved it. And I learned a lot. And if you have any more questions, put them in the comments. So those are my reflections about living in the tiny. Thanks for letting me babble on, and appreciate each and every one of you. Come back on Thursday when we'll have another grocery haul and meal plan. Back in the big city.